so on that way. That's just it's a big swath of land to
Big consideration.
extend. Yeah, right. Without
You're making a decision on something that we don't know.
right, we have no idea. It might sit like that for the next 50 years. Kind of like, who knows? So I think that's
But you open the door.
right. Once it's zoned, it's zoned. Kind of. There's no going back. Well, there is, but.
Any more discussion? I'll just like to make a general comment to the audience. If you've never been to one of these meetings, you can kind of see we get in the weeds with a lot of information. One thing you need to understand, every so often we update the comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan is, I've referred to it at these meetings as the Bible. Not everybody follows the Bible, but the comprehensive plan is, there's a great deal of input that talks about where things go, what's around them, and does it fit? And so it's a guideline for us to use when we're considering things like this. So the things you've heard tonight that the staff has pointed out, that yeah, it could kind of fit, but then it could also maybe be a little bit of a stretch. So one of the things we have to consider when we're looking at this is, does it comply with that? That's why they have us up here, because if it was all just a comprehensive plan, you say, well, this, and this, then it would be done. So that's why you have us here to kind of consider and hear from the community. So I appreciate you all coming out this evening, and I want to apologize to you that you're going to have to come back, but I think if you have an interest in this, and if you're available, I think it would be good for you to be here. So we've heard the comments this evening, and we'll, I guess at this time, Matt, unless there's any other comments from the commission, I think what now I would entertain a motion to table this action.
And I think you all can have some discussion and maybe involve staff on what dates you'd like to do that on.
Okay.
So, I prefer as many people on the commission to be here as possible.
And maybe consult with the applicant as well.
Right.
Out of town, depending on how the next year.
So can we
So
kind of,
does our motion have to set a date in stone, or?
think
Yes,
we
that would be preferred.
Yes.
Simple. That way, we don't have to resend all the notice.
22nd, is that
April 22nd?
April 22nd? That's a Tuesday, 22nd at this point. Developers, 22nd, work for you? Okay. Okay, all right.
So real fast, so you said you do not have to send notices again, though?
Correct.
Okay, what about the individuals that aren't here related?
We don't have to send new notices to anyone except for the individual who did not receive notice. We send the notice on April 22nd meeting.
Can I make one request of staff that we add, for our staff report that day, that you add the finding to the first staff finding?
Yes.
Where Aaron added the safer
Objective
language.
G.
Yes,
Yeah.
we'll update that. Yes.
So I'd like to have a motion, if you will, someone would like to make one.
I'll make the motion that we table public hearing 2225 PCO 6 until the commission meeting on April 22nd.
A motion made and second. Any question on the motion? I'll now call for the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Let the record show that the proposal's been tabled to April 22nd. If you were here for this meeting, and we have other business to attend to, if you were here for that and you'd like to leave, you're welcome to do that. We're going to take about 3 or 4 minute recess here. So again, thank you for coming this evening, and we'll see you here in a little bit.
reach out to you.
We'll figure it out.
Okay. Okay, all right. Thank you.
I probably take care of it. I'll let you take care of that stuff, I'm sure.
You guys ready?
Here's the big that we're missing Ken and Matt.
How you doing?
All right, you're here for this. You're just gonna say something, but he was ready to go.
I got just a minute.
The only question, it's, the last part.
When we talk about, like, being at our meetings, so you can do something, right? So, yeah. Okay, I know. All the KYTC guys are.
I'm sorry,
Made me go to a crawl.
I think that
They did like for my me.
I think it's an initiative.
I don't see the water. I'm just saying. I didn't see the water.
You didn't want to get thrown into the fire with all that. I get it. I'm generally offended in the world.
By the way, we're recording. Are we good?
Yeah, it's still
All right, I'm going to call our planning commission meeting back to order. It's currently 8:12. The last item of business is public hearing 2025 PCO 7, residential zoning text amendment. I'll turn it over to Mr. Riverman, who promises to say we're going to be efficient with this. Right?
I'll stop short of the promise. It's like 35 days. But Joe Redmond with Elizabethtown Planning Development. So you should have a staff report with you and the proposed text amendments. This was something we discussed, I think about a year ago, maybe even a little bit more than a year ago, where we talked about needing to update the residential development standards in the zoning ordinance. And so we kind of started the process back then. We got some help from Ken and Keast should be built in order to increase that supply and encourage and incentivize development, residential developments to increase that supply and thereby helping affordability. Encouraging infill and redevelopment, which is a little bit tougher a lot of times than building out in greenfields and open lands out away from the city. So we need to look at always trying to encourage those infill developments closer to the city, and then just kind of clarifying some definitions that we have. So I'm going to go through this really quick, but in the comprehensive plan, this is in the staff report as far as justification for that, but there's several goals and objectives within the comprehensive plan that are relative to housing and residential development. So goal 1 of land use just talks about the adequate supply of housing. There was a report done last year in all of Hardin County that shows that we're 4,500 units short of housing units short in Hardin County as a whole. A lot of that falls into Elizabethtown since we are the county seat and have a good chunk of that residential development. But a lot of people are saying that there's a lot bigger shortage than that 4,500. We've been making a dent in that the last couple of years, but we're definitely still short in housing than everybody is right now. Goal 8 talks about housing specifically to support the multiple housing types, encourages mix of housing types, lot sizes and neighborhoods, densities in neighborhoods. Goal 8 talks about supporting affordable housing. It also talks about incentivizing dense and compact developments. And there's just some information on that. Goal 9 talks about downtown and increasing density downtown. So that's the conversation that we've had before. Something that we're looking at with our downtown master plan. We recently, I think last year, I think it's been 2 years ago, or last year, allowed or eliminated the density maximum downtown, I believe. So we've done part of that work, and there's really nothing in our standards that we're talking about today specific to downtown. And then in our comprehensive plan, it also talks about the different types of densities and of residential development, suburban residential, urban residential, high density residential, and mixed use areas, and what those densities should look like. So we have a little bit of guidance through all of that from our comprehensive plan to look at on what we have decided that we want our city to be in the next 20 years and what that looks like from a residential development standpoint. The next thing we did back in July of last year was we had a focus group. So we invited a lot of stakeholders, people who have some professional work in the housing and building industry to talk to us about some of what the needs that we have in the community are and what are some of the problems that they're seeing that we have. So I listed some of those here. The need for smaller lot sizes. They're telling us that the market is kind of demanding those smaller lot sizes. Everybody knows there's a need for more affordable housing, and that goes way beyond zoning, of course, but the ability to build a variety of housing types, housing affordability in the market was kind of discussed and how that was working. There was comments, and I'll give all of us a little bit of praise here. There was some developers and builders that commented on the development process. Newtown working really well, and that's a testament, at least partly, to the planning commission as well, and how we serve our citizens. The need for mixed-use developments, neighborhood commercial, and desirable within those mixed-use developments, kind of what Kyle was talking about previously in the last case, and the flexibility of housing types and densities being desirable. So a lot of those things are things that were kind of covered in the comprehensive plan too. So there's a lot of overlap between what our comprehensive plan tells us and what people are kind of telling us that we need to be looking at. So again, just kind of before we ever really got started with the meat of the updates, some of the goals that we had for this update was number 1, always trying to align this with the comprehensive plan, but also trying to align this with our current market demand, which is different now than when these regulations were adopted 20 or 25 or more years ago. The market now is a lot different, especially after the recession of 2008. We've seen that across the country. We haven't seen that too much in E-Town until the last few years when we saw the big residential boom in our city. And we saw a lot of different housing types and styles coming into our city at a much faster pace than what we've seen in the past. And so we're seeing a lot of those new types of market demands that that are not to increase the density that's allowed within that zoning district, but just to have a smaller lot size. So sometimes they may ask for an increase in zoning district, where they could have provided this density in the zoning district they were in, but that zoning district was not written in a manner that allowed them to do what the zoning district says they should be doing. And then, of course, incentivizing infill and redevelopment, because that development inside the city is typically tougher, just because you have more utilities, more infrastructure that's already established, and other buildings around there. So we need to kind of account for that, and then creating new housing types and increase just generally the supply of housing, which helps with affordability. So kind of getting into, I'm not going to go through the 35 pages or whatever that is. You have that in front of you, and there's a couple minor updates that I'll mention at the end. But I'm going to kind of go through them in summary, and you can let me know if you have any specific questions. But I'll start with the definitions, which is towards the front of the zoning ordinance. The first one is to eliminate the term family within our zoning ordinance. So you have a term in a lot of zoning ordinances, including ours, that says single family, multifamily, residential zoning pieces. That's something that's kind of going by the wayside, because there's been lots of discussions about zoning ordinances restricting housing for people that are not necessarily a family. So there's a lot of like non-nuclear families that are around these days, which means they're not related by blood or adoption. Our zoning ordinance might say single family, it might say multifamily, but there's really nothing in our zoning ordinance or any other zoning ordinance that should be that essentially discriminates people from living together just because they're not related by blood. So there are maximum number of people who can live in a household based on building occupancy codes and property maintenance codes, fire safety, things like that. But if you want to live in a house with a friend, that's not restricted. But we do have a definition of family within our zoning ordinance that is really not relative. And the courts have kind of decided this over the years that it's really discriminatory for cities to prevent people from living together just because they're not related by blood or adoption. So we're looking at getting rid of that term family and kind of changing that to like a dwelling unit, which we already have a definition of dwelling unit in our zoning code. So we're kind of just changing some terminology from single family to single unit, from multifamily to multi-unit. We're adding the term accessory dwelling unit. This is already kind of permitted in some zoning districts, but we're proposing to allow that in all of the residential zoning districts. And I'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. Recovery residence is a new term to all of us in the past year or so. So Elizabethtown was one of the first, actually the first city in the state to adopt an ordinance related to recovery residences, which the state adopted a law around this time last year, I believe, related to regulating recovery residences. And that was not really about zoning, it was more about requiring these facilities to do what they were supposed to be doing based on the NAR standards and based on the standards for receiving Medicaid funding and things like This is just a summary of single unit instead of single family zoning summary. So just kind of providing an overview of what the changes are relative to how single unit subdivisions would be regulated. So you see we're in where it says cons area, that's conservation developments, cottage court developments. The main thing I'll mention here with these is that R2 is changing from 5 units per acre to 6 units per acre, and that's to fall in line with the comprehensive plan, because R1 and R2 are our suburban residential zoning districts in our comp plan, which say that we go up to 6 units per acre in the suburban zoning districts. So we're just changing that from 5 to 6 to comply with the comprehensive plan. And that's kind of the reason for the reduction in the areas. So that's 7,260 square feet. So if you divide an acre by 6, then you get 7,260. So that's the minimum lot size for an R2 subdivision with this proposal. And I'll get into conservation developments a little bit sooner, but that allows them to go down to 5,000 square foot lots, as long as they stay within that 6 units per acre. It does change the minimum lot width from 85 feet to 75 feet in all of R2, 50 feet for conservation development. Then reduces the lot width for R3 and R4, keeps all of those other densities the same. And then you notice the side yard setbacks for R3, R4, R5, and R6 going from 10 feet to 5 feet. And that's more of like a market demand issue. The reason we've had 10-foot side yard setbacks, and those are urban zoning districts, R3 to R6, so those are more of our urban areas. The reason we have those 10-foot setbacks is historically we've always had each residential property with a 10-foot side yard setback adjacent to 10 feet, and we had a 20-foot easement essentially between the two properties where we would have rights to take care of drainage issues or things like that. That's not really how a lot of single unit neighborhoods are developed these days. A lot of them have smaller yards, smaller side yard setbacks, and as long as they comply with our density standards, we didn't necessarily see a problem with reducing that side yard setback. What we would do, and what we've talked with Rita Davis, our stormwater engineer, about doing in these situations is when we have these subdivisions come before us, we plan to look at those grading and drainage plans a little bit more closely with those subdivision level improvement plans to make sure that we are accounting for having appropriate easements and appropriate basins and appropriate measures for stormwater runoff measures within the subdivision without having the easement between every single house, which is not done everywhere. That's somewhat unique to our area, at least for urban areas. It's somewhat unique that we have. So, proposing to reduce those side yard setbacks to 5 feet. And then just a couple of samples that we did just to look at R2 and R4, which are our zoning districts that have the majority of our single unit subdivisions in them. So we looked at Ashton Park, which is just northwest of our airport. It's an R2 development. And that one, if you recall, R2 currently allows 5 units per acre. That was developed at a density of 4.58 lots per acre, which is actually really high. It's very difficult actually to reach close to that maximum density. So they did a pretty good job of reaching close to that maximum density of 5 units per acre. And so that's just one example of an R2 subdivision that we have and how that was developed. And then again, just the proposed going from 5 units to 6 units, which changes the minimum lot size, and then the lot width going from 85 feet to 5 feet, 75 feet, sorry. And then R4, we looked at Magnolia Gardens. The typical lot width there is 65 feet. The minimum lot width today is 60 feet. to a point where we can develop a single unit subdivision up to 10 units per acre, because that's really not going to be feasible even with a 50-foot wide lot that we're proposing with this proposal, or 5-foot side yard setbacks. There's really no way we're going to get a single unit subdivision at 10 units per acre. The other development options that we have for cottage courts and townhouses would really probably be, we're doing duplexes on lots to get the even smaller lot widths would probably be the only way they would be allowed to get anywhere close to that 10 units per acre. So that 10 units per acre is pretty safe as far as R4 is concerned. So then I'll get into some of the additional development options. So these are the adding residential uses in commercial zoning districts. That's something we currently don't permit. That's something that a lot of cities will allow. We talked about in trying to encourage mixed-use developments or planned developments. Well, allowing residential and commercial zoning districts is an easy way to do that, to allow people to do commercial and mixed use. So that allows you to do commercial on the first floor and do apartments above the commercial. So that would be allowed in our commercial zoning districts. And that's, doing multifamily and commercial zoning district is typically very compatible, especially if you're adding them into existing commercial zoning districts. We still would encourage people to rezone to commercial just to build apartments. We would still encourage them to use R6. But this would be more for existing commercial areas that maybe want to be redeveloped, or they want to add residential units as kind of a mixed-use development or onto an existing commercial development. I think that's something that we want to encourage to allow that more pedestrian-friendly development. It provides more opportunities for housing, which we need in developed areas. So that seems like a positive thing to us. Adding a planned development district, which I'll get into, conservation development, which I'll get into, cottage court development, townhouse and accessory dwelling units. Residential and commercial zoning district I kind of talked about, provides an opportunity for additional housing that is compatible. It's pretty easy to make new multi-unit residential uses in existing commercial areas be compatible, and provides an opportunity for that mixed-use development that our comprehensive plan says we need to encourage. So planned developments, we have a couple of options in our existing zoning code that aren't really utilized very well. So if they're not really familiar with developers that do planned development style, which is kind of your more what they call traditional town type developments, where you have the smaller lots and you kind of build it like in the old style with the alleys in the back, and you mix in the corner commercial, those types of. That's kind of like your planned development. If you think of something like Norton Commons up in Louisville, that would be like your planned development district. And our zoning standards don't really work for people like that, and they don't really understand our standards. So we're trying to add a new zoning district that would be more in line with allowing that. So it's basically a zoning district that allows the developer to define their own land uses and development standards. It would have to go through a zoning change, so it would have to go through the process, present a master plan to the commission and city council and get that approved, and develop their own regulations as approved by the planning commission and city council that define their development standards. I won't go into Norfolk, Virginia, but we kind of use them as a guideline for how we organized this. We didn't really copy their language, but we kind of used the organization of how they do it. So the planned development district that we have proposed is 154.068. First, it kind of lists out the procedures for how to go about getting that. So that's essentially just a zoning change. There's nothing kind of fancy about that. So you would just ask for a zoning change to the PDD zoning district, and then it defines the process to amend the PD, which is essentially going through that same process. So you would ask for a zoning change to get the PD. You would have a master plan proposal that basically gives a plan for how the property would be subdivided, where certain uses would be allowed, and there's a number of ways you can go about that. So it's very flexible, but they basically have to present that to the planning commission and justify how that complies with the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan through a zoning change process. And then in each one of those zones or areas or properties that they define on this master plan, they can define their own development standards for those areas. talks about through that master plan, the developer having to get approved by the planning commission, the lot layout, talking about environmental standards for preservation, like stream preservation or tree preservation, things like that. Site design standards for, building design, setbacks, things like that, parking location. Building design standards, sign standards, streetscape standards, access management, and open space. So those are all things that this version of the code says that they have to address, and that the commission would have to approve those items within the master plan. And there's some guidance within that ordinance on like what that should really look like. So it's not just a free for all. There is some guidance in there that says these are the things that should be addressed and why. But those are the things that are within the ordinance. And it's basically a new zoning district, so we can go more into that if you'd like. The other one is the conservation development. A lot of jurisdictions call this the conservation subdivision because it's usually done with single unit subdivisions. And so this would only be applicable to R1 and R2 in the suburban areas. This is not something that would be necessarily encouraged in an urban area. But the main thing there is that you're allowing, it's basically a density transfer or a development transfer type development, if you're familiar with those terms. But it's basically allowing you to construct smaller lots on a site, which reduces your infrastructure needs. A lot of times it preserves trees and other lands on the periphery of a property adjacent to other developments, so it provides a greater buffer. But it allows them to construct the density that's permitted within R1 and R2 on a smaller area of that lot. So it condenses that development to a small area of that lot. This is beneficial to a developer if they have a lot that has streams or other environmental constraints on the property that essentially make those portions of the property not developable. They can kind of transfer that density over to the property as a whole and allow them to do smaller lots. It's also beneficial because it reduces the infrastructure need. So they don't have to construct as many roads, as many sewer, as long as a sewer line, things like that, which by the way is also beneficial to the city because that's a lot of things that we have to maintain in the future. So, and that's one of the reasons our comprehensive plan, by the way, encourages compact dense development because that is more efficient for city funds in order for us to maintain a lot of this utility infrastructure and transportation infrastructure in the future.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Who would decide that? Staff would decide that this qualifies as a conservation development? Or is there, I see percentages down there, but it's really hard to decide where trees are and that kind of stuff.
So the idea is that there would be standards within the ordinance that would say if you can meet these standards in R1 or R2, as long as you meet that zoning, the density standard within R1, R2, and these other standards that we have for open space, for minimum buffers, and the minimum lot size for conservation developments, then you can do that by right. So it would come to the commission as like a preliminary plat, essentially. And so, but we would develop those standards within the conservation development option of what needs to be done in order to meet those standards. But it would be something that's by right. So as you know, if someone comes in with a subdivision to us today that meets the standards of our zoning and subdivision regulations, the planning commission is obligated to approve that subdivision. This would be the same way. As long as they meet the subdivision standards, the zoning standards, and these conservation development standards, the commission would be obligated to approve it.
And does this help with the water runoff? Like hypothetically, if they say you need some kind of drainage that's significantly larger than what they had accounted for, does it allow you all to say, okay, we can make this a conservation development and they can build on these smaller lots to accommodate?
Not necessarily in order to build the basin. It's intended more for preservation and buffering against adjacent properties, so preserving trees. Now, building in a smaller area and preserving that open space on other parts of the property will typically benefit stormwater runoff because you're going to have less impervious surface and you're likely going to preserve areas that might be useful for water runoff that isn't running off directly onto someone else's property. But you wouldn't necessarily be able to have a development and say, well, I'm just going to build a detention basin and transfer that density over to the rest of my lot. That wouldn't be a conservation development. That would just be a standard subdivision that would have to comply with all the
my biggest question is, do you anticipate developers coming with some issues and then you all being able to provide some solutions with these new development plans as a result? I guess that's.
Hopefully,
Okay.
yes. Yeah. I mean, some of these are not gonna be familiar. I mean, you're gonna have local developers who aren't familiar with this because it's new. You're gonna have out-of-town developers that are not familiar with this because they're from out of town, they don't know anything about our zoning regulations. So a lot of times, yes, there might, I do definitely anticipate opportunities for us to say, hey, this might be a really good opportunity for you to do a conservation development. You might actually get more lots than you would have with your standard subdivision. And it gives us the opportunity to reserve some lands that might be beneficial to the city and to adjacent properties.
So when you say that the sewer, you know, you mentioned that there wouldn't be as much of a load on the sewer, but you also consider the stormwater drainage, correct? Because you've got, as you just said, you've got less impervious surface, so that's another issue which you just talked about.
So it is ultimately less stormwater runoff.
Okay.
It is.
So, two questions. So just to make sure I understand this. So let's say it's R2, and it's 10 acres, but only 7 of which are buildable. I can build 60 lots, if I can fit them, I could build 60 lots on those 7 acres instead of being able to do the 42
Correct.
that would be, right?
Correct.
Okay. Second thing, section D2 on this is a minimum of the 25% of the common open space shall be usable and open to the public. So does that have to be like a park? Or what is it, what do you mean by open to the public? Is that just,
Yeah, it
Like
doesn't
a shoreline
necessarily
area?
have to be a park. It could just be, it could be, you know, a trail. It could be just open grass field or something. It could be land that is dedicated to the city potentially, if that was something that worked out for everyone. To develop a park, I mean, it could be a park as well.
Sure.
Yeah, just open space that's usable means that it's not just a stream or a group of trees or a
but it's not
forest.
necessarily private property.
Not necessarily.
I mean, if it's open to
It
the
probably
public,
would be in most scenarios, but it doesn't have to be correct.
who would own it, take care of it?
A homeowners association, usually in most situations, it would be a homeowners association. And we would require that to be recorded, established with a recording of the subdivision plan. Here's just kind of a picture that, I mean, we talked about it, kind of taking smaller lots and preserving parts of land up to 30%. But yeah, so the standard that we put in there is just to preserve 30% of the total site as open space essentially. And then cottage court development, and I'll just throw up a picture really quick just to kind of give you an idea. So it's basically where you kind of get like a pedestrian court or something. So you can imagine where this is a public, well, yeah, like this would be a public street, and these houses all kind of face an internal courtyard. And so the benefit to doing this is you still have to fall within the density allowance in the zoning district that you're located in, but we eliminate all of the minimum lot size standards. So you could put this all on one lot. You could have each house on their individual lot. This could be a really small lot, because there's no minimum in this case, as long as you're meeting that density. With the only requirements would be essentially that you have that common open space pedestrian area in the middle that opens up to a public street. That each unit kind of has that ground floor entrance. They can be 2 stories, but they have to have each like one unit per area of the lot. And then they have to have parking areas that are kind of either to the side or to the rear. There's some design standards for the portions of those garages and things that are visible from the street, and the portions of the houses that are visible from the street. So, and that's not something we anticipate being used a lot either. But again, it's just providing that flexibility and another option for someone to get maybe a few more houses than they would have been able to. You know, they might have fit 6 houses on that lot, but now they can actually get 10 cottage courthouses on that lot. That's standard. So again, it's subject to the base density, so we're not increasing the density for this. We're just saying that there's no minimum lot size, so you can be creative. We do have setbacks from adjacent properties because we still want to respect those existing adjacent properties. This is something you would probably see more in urban settings the street network, and then the design standards for facades facing the street. Townhouse development, this is another option that would start in R4, be available in R5 and R6. And there's townhouses, just like a townhouse, everybody knows what a townhouse is. And this is not something new necessarily, I'm not sure there's very many of these in Elizabethtown, but it's certainly not new to anybody. But it's again, subject to the base density of whatever zoning district it's in. And again, it's an option with these certain standards that that you have to have a ground level living space, you have to orient the unit towards the street. Garages cannot be oriented towards the street, it has to be accessed from a rear alley or a rear parking area or something. And then the benefit is, we say there's no minimum lot size, as long as you comply with the density requirement, we're going to give you this flexibility as long as you meet these few standards that we have to kind of build up to that density that's allowed in the zoning district. And again, that's more of an urban development there too. Accessory dwelling units we touched on earlier. This isn't something necessarily new, but we're kind of defining it and saying that this is something that's allowed in all of these residential zoning districts, including R1 and R2. The point to make here is that these accessory dwelling units, and this has been proven across the country, these do not impact the look of the neighborhood at all. They don't really impact traffic and things negatively. They're subject to the design standards for accessory structures. These can be built in garages, they can be built as secondary structures on a lot. If you have those with an accessory structure, they have to meet those accessory structure standards that we have for garages and everything else. But you're allowed to integrate these into houses, and these are just kind of some examples of what they might look like. So you can integrate accessory dwelling units into the house. The standards that we have in the ordinance basically says you can do this, but as long as it doesn't look like a duplex or something else. It has to look like it's a single unit house, essentially. So as long as you do that, you can have that additional accessory dwelling unit. And accessory means it's smaller than the principal dwelling unit, of course. So it limits it to a size of 25% of the principal structure or principal residence, or 800 square feet, whichever is larger. And we don't allow them, if someone has it as a short-term rental, you're not allowed to also have an accessory structure there. So it's really intended for someone who's living on the property. It's not limited to people who own the property, but it has to be an occupied permanent residence of the property. And you can't do it with like a manufactured home or trailer. And it just requires one additional parking space.
Do you have any concern about additional parking space?
No. What do you mean?
I was thinking downtown in particular, so many of these could accommodate in-laws or like a
Yeah.
couple, and with only one additional one and already compact space.
Well, in downtown specifically, if you're in the C5, that doesn't require any parking at all. In other neighborhoods surrounding downtown, I would argue that we don't necessarily want to increase parking too much in those neighborhoods around downtown. We want to support more housing development in those areas and not necessarily create more parking spaces that are necessary. We do have on-street parking available.
But are there restrictions to where these ADUs can be built, or is it everywhere within those?
Within all of the residential zoning districts, is what's proposed in here, you can have an accessory dwelling unit as long as you, and this is just a residential zoning district, as long as you have that one additional parking space. So each single unit house is required to have 2 parking spaces, and then if you have an ADU, you'd be required to have 3.
Would that look, so, sorry to get into parking, you know my heart about parking, it's really bad where I am. But like, does that parking count toward if you have a driveway that accommodates 3 cars?
Sure. Yeah.
Or-
It doesn't have to be garage spaces. So no single unit.
And
house.
does it have to be adjacent or connected? So looking at that detached ADU for, I think it was D. So there's driveway space up the front of the main residence.
Mhm.
Would that count, or does it have to be adjacent there? To the
Any space that's on that driveway that's not over the sidewalk would count. So typically, driveway spaces are about 18 or 20 feet long. So as long as you have that
mentioned in-laws. So as it currently stands, you are allowed to have an accessory dwelling unit on your property for a mother-in-law, father-in-law, in-laws, anything with anybody, as long as you don't charge rent. So this.
I would definitely charge rent in my situation.
But this would eliminate that, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
Moving on. So community gardens, this really shouldn't be too controversial, but it just allows community gardens. And I think there's, I don't know if we have a definition for that, but it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a community garden. It's just a garden that's accessible to the community. You can't, it's not something intended for sale, for having for sale items on the site. It's just intended for people in the community to be using that. The standards say that equipment and materials stored on the site, they should be in a structure or fully screened from adjacent properties. Setbacks required for composting, and then if you cease operations of the community garden, must be destroyed. But this is usually something that's generated by the neighborhood. This isn't something the city or a developer is going to go out and propose. This is something, an option for the community to say, we want a garden, we have this lot, we want to do this garden, and we're just saying that we want to support that. There's a couple of them around town, and it's not necessarily prohibited necessarily, but we're just kind of expressly permitting it within all of the residential and commercial zoning districts. Home occupations, I'm just noting that because there's some changes. We're taking the standards out of the definitions and adding it into the new standards at the end of the zoning district, so no substantive changes to that. And then conditional use permits, same thing, there's no substantive changes to that. We're just kind of moving those standards to a new section. We did have a few new standards for the review and approval, just kind of standard procedural type things for how conditional use permits are processed. And then short-term rentals, which might be the biggest point of the discussion. So right now, owner-occupied short-term rentals, which means you live in the house, you own the house and you live there, you're allowed to have a short-term rental of your house or a room in your house up to 10 times per year or 10 nights per year. And that's not proposed to change. We just simply move those standards within each zoning district to combine them to another standard. What we are proposing are these non-owner occupied short-term rentals. So these are more of a commercial type use as opposed to a residential type use. So this basically means that nobody is living in that house or that unit permanently. It's only rented out on a short-term basis. Short-term meaning less than 30 days at a time. So it could be one night, it could be 29 nights at a time, but that counts as a short-term rental. And that would be that no one is living there. So currently, this is only permitted, anywhere hotels are permitted, of course, but also in the R6 zoning district. We're actually proposing to remove that out of R6 because that concern is that you turn an apartment complex into a hotel. If you allow all of them to be short-term rentals, that's essentially a hotel, and that's not the intent of the apartment complex. So that hasn't happened yet, but we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So we're taking that out as an option. And it's currently listed as a residential use, and we disagree that it's a residential use. It's really more of a commercial use because there's nobody residing there permanently. It's a transient use, more similar to a hotel. And so how do we handle that option? Because there are a lot of these non-owner occupied home, short-term rentals in Elizabethtown. They're difficult to regulate, and they're difficult to catch because, you can find them on Airbnb and sites like that. In order to really kind of cite them and kind of enforce that, you have to find some type of evidence that someone's actually using it. Just the fact of advertising your residence on Airbnb in and of itself is not a violation because that doesn't prove that you're actually using it as an Airbnb. So going through the process of proving that is a little bit more cumbersome and complicated than just finding someone on Airbnb. But we do know because of Airbnb that there are a lot of these out there. We just know through just kind of first and second-hand knowledge that a lot of these are not houses where somebody resides permanently. So we know this is happening. Our opinion, at least at staff level, is that it's not necessarily a problem. Where it could potentially become a problem is with the concentration of these types of short-term rentals was to require a conditional use permit for these, and put some sort of density cap or distance requirement between non-occupied short-term rentals. So that is completely up for discussion. If you know of another way to regulate that or prevent entire streets from becoming non-owner occupied short-term rentals, we are all ears. We don't necessarily want to add a bunch more work to us at staff level to have a bunch of conditional use permits coming in at one time, but I couldn't think of a better way to regulate that if we're going to allow them at all.
Hey Joe, I have a couple questions for maybe about the one part of this before we get into the rest of it. So in the R6 thing, you want to remove that. So I know we don't have a ton or maybe any of this right now where I build a complex and I sell the units rather than, so it's R6, it's zoned R6 for the density, but I sell individual units instead of just renting them out. If you buy, because it's in R6, if you buy one of the units, you could not do any sort of short-term rental at that point, even with the, or would that be even with the conditional use permit, or would you, if with that conditional use, you could do it?
Yeah, so I think owner occupied in this standard would be a land property owner. It sounds like you're potentially talking about a condominium owner.
Basically, yeah.
So yeah, in R6, that would not be allowed, correct?
Even with the conditional use permit?
Even with the conditional use.
'Cause it-
Let me,
Well, the other reason I ask is then it says in R6, the new conditional use permits for non-owner occupied, that's what we said.
oh, yes,
Yeah,
okay, so yes.
all the way through.
So that would be allowed, but it would still be restricted to the density maximum. So here, under this circumstance.
So if I get one, I'm the only one that can be there.
Unit, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
interesting.
And we did talk about this, we did have a R6, the one that is where the sports park dead ends, and he said when asked, the possibility could be. Yeah, on St. John Road, forgive me. So like it is going to happen, but I'm confused now. Is it possible with some legalese that if somebody buys those as a condominium concept, that those could happen in R6, or I just.
Trying to understand the question. And remember what's happening.
You sound like my children. I ask wonderful questions all the time. I'm just trying to figure out, there are workarounds, and people will do workarounds, and if we don't have official policing of this, I'm just wondering if this is all in vain, and if we should just figure out a way to make it work and just have, I don't know, I'm just.
I mean, one of the options that some communities have done is to allow waivers of their density. I mean, there's a lot of communities that have a density or distance requirement between non-owner occupied short-term rentals. And some communities allow commissions or boards of zoning to waive that standard of the density or the distance requirement. Some have said you cannot waive that standard. It's just 500 feet at 600 feet. That's that, and live with it. And that's something to consider with the ordinances if we did or did not want to allow a waiver of that 600 feet. If we thought 600 feet was too much or too little, or if there's another way to regulate that, or if we don't care, we're just going to stay.
Yeah, but I think you cited 600 feet as generally a city block, correct?
Right.
So there's no, so there's no, under the short-term rentals in R1 or R2?
Non-owner occupied, correct.
There's zero. So what do you do with them currently? Because those exist, right?
They're all over the city.
Yeah, I mean, that would be fairly easy to add. If that's something we wanted to add in there, I mean, that's easy to add. So that would be the conversation that's had.
Sure. So I guess the concern from you all with this, that your concern is having 3 short-term rentals in a row, and that being, having some sort of adverse impact? What's the adverse impact?
The people that
That
live
they're
in the
that they're essentially non-residential uses. It's essentially allowing a non-residential use within a residential zoning district. And so if you allow a row of them or
haven't seen the zoning cases yet on them, but under private residential, like subdivision restrictions that you all have, or you may have in your subdivisions, most of those have a provision that says these can be used for single-family residential uses and not for the conduct of any business. In the Kentucky Court of Appeals, one lady was doing a short-term rental, I think down in Grayson County, and her neighbor took her to court over the subdivision restrictions, and the Kentucky Court of Appeals said what Joe just said, that it is a commercial activity, it is not a residential use when interpreting those subdivision restrictions. So I think what Joe's not making this up, but there's some case law out there that says this kind of analysis, is it a use that's commercial or is it a residential use? They've kind of landed where Joe's talking about here. I'm not saying that we should jump headfirst into it. I'm just telling you that distinction's out there in case law already.
So if you've got one of these situations where maybe there's no neighborhood restriction, but one individual or multiple different individuals own property that are being used as short-term rentals, and they're within 600 feet of one another, is it just a mad race to see Joe to get it, and everybody else has to either convert their property into a long-term rental or sell it?
Potentially, I mean, the first thing to consider is they're both doing it illegally to start with. So potentially, yes, it could potentially be just a first come, first serve. You know, whoever gets their CUP first wins, and the other one's out of luck. Or we allow it to be waived by the Board of Zoning Adjustment when they're looking at the conditional use permit. The commission, or the board can look at, you know, whatever standards they deem appropriate in order to waive that standard.
I think that's more appropriate than setting some 600 feet, you know, kind of scenario. It makes more sense to me to grant a body the ability to waive it.
To grant any,
You made the comment about the various zoning districts and not being allowed here, not being allowed there. You said Board of Adjustment, is that correct? Could potentially.
waive that standard of the distance requirement.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
But he's saying leave it in, but they can still waive it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
But not include R1 and R2.
We could definitely, I'm trying to remember why I did not include R1 and R2, to be quite honest. So, I mean, that's certainly up for discussion. I'm trying to look at the actual regulation.
Well, just so the commission understands too, there's a lot of meat on this bone that we're trying to cover tonight. And I know this is a hearing, but I'm not necessarily thinking that we could not table this findings for the next meeting. There's a lot of information here. And then
Keep reviewing it, keep discussing it.
and Joe, come back with our R1, R2 situation. Anything else we come up with tonight, because there's a lot of information here. We do need to do it, but I mean, I want to feel comfortable with it.
Well, and I will comment that the short-term rentals, the one concern I have is that if someone has property, say they have a block of property, and I understand what you're saying, Joe, completely, but if they can't make the money they want off that property that they have purchased, they could easily sell it to recovery housing. And it would be accepted and go immediately. And as a neighbor, I would prefer to have the short-term rentals. And I say that only because there have been people who have said that in homeowners associations already locally, well, I'll just sell it to make it recovery housing. I just don't want to make it so restrictive that people look to other options that might not be as ideal for neighborhoods.
And I might just from the city council portion of it, you know, I do believe, and Joey, you can kind of add on this, we do get a lot of comments from individuals when it's referencing short-term rentals. Like, I know there's a couple, like, streets that have several on them, you know, and that is one of the calls that we get. And I kind of felt like, I think statewide, they were really looking portion of it, of course, with it being a business and just having one of these at one point in time, you have that occupational portion of it that comes into play. And right now, there's really no way to manage all of that. And I think with those conditional use, that could kind of add into some guidance there, so.
Well, and I think that the tax money would be outstanding for the city to get some money. Is there any opportunity for that?
To get tax from the.
Short term?
So,
We're supposed to be doing it.
That's a whole
Yeah.
other conversation.
Yeah.
so that's, yeah.
But then how do you know, and it kind of went back, like, how do you know that's even occurring? And so therefore, if they do have a commercial.
There's a whole nother statewide law somewhere about getting tax money from Airbnb.
Like transient room tax,
Yeah.
like it's a hotel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Two questions about this and some other pieces of it to get it out tonight, just to keep us thinking. One, so currently, I want to make sure I'm under the correct thing. There is you can operate non-owner occupied short-term rentals in the city, correct? Or is that not a?
No. No. Only in R6 and in commercial zoning districts. That's it.
Okay.
There's a lot of them in R4, R2.
Right, so that's where you're saying though, but it's hard for you to go and find them or do whatever.
Yes.
Right, so if it's C2 though, the way this is written here, under the for short-term rentals, all that, on, so 154.062, C2 neighborhood commercial, or C1 for that matter. If it's in a commercial district, it's fine?
Yes, and I believe C2, now C3 allows hotels, what do we call C2? Not, just not allowed hotels, so, yeah. So, I'm looking at what we put in there for C2. So C2 does not allow hotels. What we put in there that allows
Under special provisions,
owner
E7.
occupied.
That's owner occupied.
I don't know why I put that in the wrong spot. But yes, I would think that's reasonable to add as a, maybe a permitted use within C2. And that's not in there currently because C2 doesn't currently allow residential uses pretty much at all, so.
But we're adding in those, right?
But we're adding in those, so it would be appropriate, in my opinion, if we added in non-owner short-term rentals. Potentially, it's just a use by right without requiring a CUP. I mean, if you're in a C2.
Okay. So, as well, if we're removing the word family for being discriminatory but not restrictive, right? That's what you're saying? It's not actually restrictive, but it is discriminatory to have the word in there?
Yeah, the definition we have right now has been deemed inappropriate by the courts. The definition of family that we have, and limiting households to 6 people related by blood or adoption has been deemed, I'm going to say inappropriate, I'm not going to say illegal.
Only reason I'm saying, if that were doing that, R3, R4, R5, and R6, families not been removed out of these that you all sent out.
Whoops.
So if these are final documents, they're still there. R1 and R2, they were stricken and dwelling unit was written next to it, but 3, 4, 5, and 6, at least of what I got, were all.
That's our six right here, specified single family detached.
Right. But it should be,
So the verbiage needs to,
R6, I noticed, that's one that was brought to my attention.
well, right here too.
yeah, you might just control that family. That might be the easiest way to do it.
If you're taking the word family out of
It's
the text,
Well,
I agree.
like R1 and R2, it's removed.
I'd be surprised if that's all that's in there, there's a lot of.
Yeah, no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was
No,
not
there-
there.
there's-
These like final
There's a
documents.
whole
are
lot to
weird.
digest right here.
Yeah.
Is there, can we go back to, this was at the very beginning, and I probably should have stopped for questions. Your steering committee, do you have who was in attendance? We got their key points, but can you just clarify, like the groups? I don't need to know people's names, but like what groups or,
Builders, developers, planning commissioners, planning staff.
that brings me to a point, you know, Joe, I don't know how much more you have to cover here, but, you know, we've got a lot of meat on this. Do we need to think about the folks who came tonight, you know, because this is a hearing? Do we want to, what's the commission's wishes? Do you want to continue this
I don't think you're gonna get to a point where we're gonna make a recommendation on this tonight. There's too much to digest. One person's opinion.
No,
Yeah, I agree.
that's what I'm asking.
I don't think I think there's too much to do.
We've held text amendment hearings open for
Yeah, 2-3
weeks
years.
or months
Yes.
at a time.
And I
As
think
we
that's
work through
that's appropriate here.
lots of meat on the bone like this before, so
Yeah.
it's up to the planning commission to decide how long we want to go tonight.
I do think if we have people who are here that want to speak, I think it's appropriate to let them speak, since they're here. I don't know what you all think about that. Yeah, what you were saying.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. That's why I'm asking where you are in that. If we could,
I'm done with the presentation, I mean, I could spend all night going through this.
Please don't.
I'd be happy to do so, but I'd be the only one happy to sit here.
well, Matt, am I going to be in order if I go ahead and say at this particular point, we will come back to Joe's explanation of this and then let the folks that are here have some
That's
testimony?
fine.
Is that okay?
That's fine. The hearing would remain open, you just
Okay.
move to continue it to a new date for further discussion at the end of our discussion tonight.
I'll relieve you, sir. If there's anyone here that wants to come forward and speak regarding these amendments and what we're considering this evening, I need you to come forward, state your name and address at the podium. Now's your time.
A little stiff now? I'm sure you guys are all stiff as well. Just a couple of comments on there overall.
I'm sorry, I need your name.
Oh, I'm sorry,
and address.
Todd
That's
Evelyn.
okay.
Todd Evelyn, 185 Evelyn Lane, East Elm. Just wanted to talk a little bit specifically. One, I do appreciate all the changes that you guys are putting in. I do think a lot of the ones around the lot size and the variations and things like that are very helpful to Elizabethtown and the development of downtown and adding a lot more density to housing. So that part's great. Areas, just to not drag it out, the areas that I have concerns about are just around the discussion of short-term rentals, being a short-term rental person as well, and also this local businessman, real estate, etc. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm a little concerned about the conversation around illegal, that it's illegal, because we had a conversation, we had a meeting a year and a half ago, I think, where we all came in and we talked about it. So I don't understand the legality part of it, that the units may be illegal in that term, and maybe there's something we missed from that time, but I've even had a question around mine, called down, talked to you and Aaron, and we've talked about a couple of specific units that addresses them, and they weren't considered illegal. So if something's changed, then I missed a meeting or missed something somewhere on about short-term rentals and the legality of them. And I know some of it may depend on the location, whether it's in a C district or in our district, but one in particular in our district as well. So we probably just need to clarify that for the short-term rental community, what that really means. I think that just would be helpful, because I don't think anybody thinks they're operating illegally unless they've been told that in some particular area. So I think we need to understand what that definition means, and if there were, how did that change, and then what do we need to do to remedy that. The other is around the ADUs, because I know that all over Elizabethtown, there's ADUs everywhere, right? Mostly above garages, behind a lot of houses that have been there from being built in the early 1900s, and a lot of them are around there. So I just think limiting, if you have a non-occupied short-term rental, that a lot of people would purchase those for that particular reason, that it has a second unit to it that could be used as being able to rent both of those within a unit. So I don't think that, I think that's pretty commonplace. I'm very versed in the short-term rental around the country. I spend a lot of time on a lot of podcasts and talking to groups that are in, all they use to develop short-term rentals. A lot of them target properties like that because the EDUs are something that you get the opportunity to get a little more bang for your buck as far as a dollar value on that. The other is on the space limit that you all talked about, the 600-foot density limit on short-term rentals. There, especially too, there's some existing units I know that are within 600 today, so I don't know what would happen to those, and should a person who's in business, who's relied on this income or develop this business, all of a sudden be told that you gotta go sell a property or do something that the numbers didn't work for. You bought the property based on a financial model that said this number works in short-term rental, that maybe didn't work in long-term rental. And so now all of a sudden if that changes and now your model doesn't work, then now you're underwater on property from a value standpoint of what you purchased it for. So that's a concern. And I know that local introduced that 600-foot limitation, and I know that's now being challenged at the state level. I don't know if you guys are familiar with SB 61, Senate Bill 61. It's already passed through the first time, now it's gone through the second, and then it's talking about towns would not be able to limit the densities to 600, or they didn't say 600, limit the density of short-term rentals within town. So that's one that I don't know if that proposal would be prudent even at this point, because it may be moved coming from the state level that would override the locals. And there may be more details around that I'm not familiar with. Just in reading that, talking with the representatives who did that, they stated that was most likely going to be approved. Right now, Amendment 3 is the one that addresses that. For SB 61, it's had to recirculate it again. And it's already been approved through the representatives, and the Senate will most likely approve it since they approved the first one clarification. So that's my comments on that. I just think it affects the business model. If I went and purchased a duplex and decided that, and based on the cost of the duplexes, the numbers would only work doing short-term rentals, then I couldn't rent out both sides of it in that method because I'd be limited to 600 feet. So you couldn't have anything that close. And I understand the concerns that some people may not want them taking over our neighborhood or something like that, but one thing is short-term rentals are typically well taken care of. They're usually better taken care of than long-term rentals. I've had long-term rentals, still have one, but I kind of got out of that. They're harder to keep up with and maintain because you're not at those properties all the time. You're not monitoring them, and with the turnover, if your property's not well taken care of, then you're not going to get guests. So typically, you end up with a nicer property next to you. There's several in town that myself and others I know have taken homes that are decrepit homes and turned them into pretty nice homes and properties. So they actually increase the value of the neighborhood that we've done updates to. And that's it.
Can we ask questions?
Sure.
Since he's kind of a subject matter expert in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, if you're working with staff, you're doing this above board. This is like, you're the exception to why we would even need to make these kind of things. At what point does it become a concern, like neighbors complaining to you? Where are the pain points you have as an owner and operator of these?
I've been very fortunate. I really have not had complaints, and I've met usually with my neighbors on any of them that I've owned and said, hey, if you have any problem too, I'll give you my number, call me right away. I monitor them, the limits. Both Airbnb and VRBO, they have restrictions in there. You don't allow parties. So if one's going on, people only hear the horror stories when you hear short-term rental stories. All you're going to get is the exception, just like the 1,000 people that climbed the mountain, 2 of them fell off and died. You're only going to hear about the 2 that died. You don't hear about the success stories, right? So most of the time, I haven't heard of other people who said they had neighbors complaining. I think I was sitting in a meeting, and you actually commented too. I think when someone stood up and said, you know, I was really upset, they were using this house as a rental, and they had kids playing baseball all out in the street. Well, any kids may play baseball on any street that they move people in, that, you know, people move in, they have kids who are gonna play baseball on the street. We all played in the street as kids, and I think that was a comment you maybe even said at one of the meetings.
I have 3 of them that are causing problems and.
And so it can happen with anybody, because we all know baseball is a big draw to E-Town. And that's about the only kind of complaints that I've heard. You know, occasionally you'll hear a noise complaint that you could have that on a regular rental that you really can't do very much about. Compared, you know, they can always call the police, but you have, as an owner, you have more avenues to kick the people out and get rid of them that day versus a renter. You take them out for a month. It takes months to get a renter out of the place, where you can actually get rid of them that night. And like I said, I've been very fortunate, and a lot of mine are actually in the commercial area, so I'm okay from that standpoint. But at the same time, you know, in the downtown square area, but you don't typically run into that many complaints, but I think communicating with your neighbors helps, so you get feedback from them if you have any issues, and they can reach out and call you in. Like I said, I haven't had issues, but.
I'm wondering about the locations too, and this is completely hypothetical. I don't know if we could do this, but can we put parameters on where the short-term rentals are most appropriate, whether they be around community facilities, like the sports park, or like these that draw people in, because those would be most lucrative to them. Do you feel like yours are in certain places like that, or do you kind of see across the board?
Mine are in all downtown area, because my target is to help be part of that growth downtown with the updates and changes and all that. And some of the areas around Main Street, there are several right in that area that I know that other people I know have. And it's the same thing, they're all walking distance pretty much downtown. I think what you're gonna start finding though, is if you get into these residential areas, the numbers don't work. Because right now Airbnbs have slowed down in this area overall. I've got, you know, good locations, so it's not been too bad, but a lot of the Airbnb people in this area aren't doing very well right now. A lot of them are selling their Airbnbs who are located in these neighborhoods that aren't near a sports park or near a downtown event area, because the numbers aren't working for them anymore. And as they build more and more hotels, although there's still a large group of people that don't want to stay in hotels, they'd rather stay in Airbnb than they go somewhere and not have to be around hundreds of people in and out of the hotel all day. So, and COVID was a big driver of that. That drove the Airbnb business pretty high, because people didn't want to be around other people. They'd rather rent something separate. But I think the numbers are not working as well as they used to for people that buy out in these neighborhoods that aren't close to the sports parks or downtown, things like that. So I think you're going to see some of that change over time naturally, just because of natural. You know, you had a big boost with Ford and all the workers in. You had a run with Airbnbs or midterm rentals, which is, you know, a whole separate category from short term and long term. That's all of that's faded out now because of the Ford workers being much cheaper now.
And so I think you're saying exactly. At one point, like, we were depending on these short terms because we didn't have the hotel space, and there were teams coming to the sports park hypothetically that were told, you all have to stay within this area, like that's part of the requirement kind of thing.
Right.
So you're seeing that shift, and do we have any feedback from tourism consistent with that shift for staff?
The data exists, I think. But I don't know if they're sharing that with you all or anything like that, but.
You look under they're all over.
But same thing about the transient room tax or finding these. it's hard for tourism to even find the availability of them, or where they are and all of that, where the hotel side is different.
It's easier to know.
And they get reports and all that, they have
And it's still a need.
star reports, full data on all that.
I mean, they're still full. I had a message, one of my messages from this past weekend was a softball tournament in town. And the guests said, thank goodness all the hotels were full. They said, we ended up having to go to Airbnb and Founders, and we liked that. It was fantastic, and, we're glad we stayed there. But that still tells you the hotels are still being fully booked. I know there's more being going to be built, but it's still a need in the area, especially in the downtown and around the sports areas.
But I would also argue that, I mean, the market desirability of Airbnbs types of uses is only minimally relative to what we're talking about with zoning. If at all.
Can you explain that? I'm done. I'm sorry. Just explain what you just said.
I thought what I heard you asking about was like essentially like the market desirability of
Well,
Airbnbs.
Is there a demand warranted by, we're bringing, and I think of teams, because you're right, the deal, or the Blue Oval SK is pretty much built, it seems like. They're transitioning out that, but
But I guess that there's probably data on, the transient rooms and like what the market is for that. I'm not sure how relative that is to how we want to regulate short-term rentals.
well, I'm just wondering, do we identify certain zones where short-term rentals are best suited because they are near community facilities that are bringing people in?
I think we're identifying zones where it would be more appropriate through what we're talking about, but not necessarily where the property is located adjacent to other uses. I don't know that we want to go down that road. I guess that's theoretically from just a language standpoint, but from a legal aspect, I'm not sure how defensible that would be.
Well, I'm just wondering, if you approve sections based on zoning, you don't have to manage and oversee them nearly as much as those outliers. Maybe I'm again, I'm no attorney, Matt is, but
And I'm just asking you hypothetically, are you thinking, okay, if it's within a half a mile of the sports park, it's permissible? Or if it's within
or
quarter of
downtown.
a mile of the square, it's permissible, but not anywhere else? I think that's what Joe's getting at, as far as if you drew circles like that, you might get accused of being arbitrary.
Okay.
Even though in our mind it makes sense, hey, we're gonna put it around the park, but it doesn't line up with anything else in the zoning ordinance as far as a zone.
And I guess mine is coming up with, so those outside of those zones would ask for a conditional use permit. And then it would reduce the 500 coming to you to possibly 25, if the conditional use permit is a concern. Like, can we say this is a great place for short-term rentals, and you don't have to worry about that process, but in these other locations, it would be worthy of a conditional use permit.
Like you're saying, anything that's in R1 or R2, like they could go get conditional use, but then like R6 or R5, they.
No, I don't think that's.
I'm thinking it's more location driven.
I think that's too
Just
subjective.
most of them are in R4s. You're
That's just restricted practice.
down there in R4.
Sports park.
I've never heard of it.
I think you can, but there's a conditional, I mean, if we're worried about staffing being able to handle it, I don't even think we need to put rules in there if you all can't handle it. Because then it's subjective as to who comes in and who doesn't. Who follows the rules and who doesn't. And that was what happened with a guy who followed the rules and wanted to go C3, and then all heck broke loose on the street as a result of it, kind of thing. So, I don't know.
I think this probably, again, I think this is a lot more to this than
Merits further discussion.
what we have here tonight, so. Any other questions for the gentleman here? Thank you so much. Anybody else that wants to come up and make a few comments here before we get ready for bed here in a little bit?
Yes.
I gotta pick up a kid off the bus at 10, I can keep going, guys.
subject to notice, or do we want to put it on a certain date?
I'd rather make a date certain, unless we'd have to re-advertise.
What's our calendar look like?
Four eight, 4/22. We currently do not have anything on April 8th. We have
Casey
quite a
and I-
few things on April 22nd. I'm guessing you don't want to do it on April 22nd. We have several projects on April 22nd.
We've already
I think, yeah,
continued one to
second.
22nd.
The other thing I think we've got to do, and I don't know about the time called over here, Commissioner, I think when we have these hearings that we know that are going to be laborious, that you got to limit the number of hearings you have on an individual meeting. Because just like this one, we don't have time to get, you honestly don't have the appropriate time to get to this one.
So some of that though gets
And
into,
I think we had the expectation that the second hearing was going to have, community input and that kind of thing. But, it's a juggling act. It's not going to be perfect no matter what. That's just comment.
No. So what do we need now? We need a motion to table this particular hearing.
to a date, and it doesn't have to be finally decided on April 8th.
It
I mean,
doesn't.
We've done this
Yeah.
before, we've
That's
put
true.
it out a couple of times because you keep getting input. That's what this whole process is about.
And that's what happened because we had the home builders that came in that wanted to have additional dialogue with staff that was going to help craft the verbiage that's now before us.
Right, so it,
Well, we could do the 8th again,
The 8th,
and then we
we'll
can
pick it
have
back up
it
and
the
finish
next
it.
time as well, so.
Yeah,
So
and
I-
if we still, we're probably going to continue it then, because I think at least two people will be out. But,
Yeah.
we're probably not going to continue it to April 22nd. Just from a case
yes.
load aspect, just FYI.
So what do y'all want to do? You want to try the 8th for those of you that aren't here, knowing that we're not going to finalize it until sometime down the road? Is that okay?
That's not me. I mean, if we know we're not gonna finalize it on the 8th, I'm fine with that. I can read minutes and watch video or
I'm
whatever.
pretty confident we're not going to
Yeah,
finalize it.
I agree. So,
You might get less talking on the 8th, hey.
Well, especially if it was something like
Continue this hearing.
Okay, we got a motion on the floor to continue this hearing to April the 8th.
second.
Motion made second. Any question on the motion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Let the record show that 4-0 to table to the 8th.
Reese.
Again, thank you all for being in and hanging in, okay? Joe might buy dinner for you next time, so we'll see. Okay, commissioner items, any commissioner items?
Not now.
Okay.
I didn't do a director's report tonight because I knew we were going to be here for a while.
Thank you.
All right, if there's nothing else, I entertain a motion to
So
adjourn.
moved.
Second, all those in favor say aye. Aye.
Okay, it comes to a
Thank
point
you.
where it's not
Yes.
very end.
Hey, thank you.
So
You
much.
got initiated